Linda Evangelista was the face that sold an entire decade. In the early 1990s, when people outside the fashion world heard the word supermodel, the image that surfaced was not a random name, but the architecture of her cheekbones, the way her hair could switch shades like a traffic light and drag an entire industry along with it, and that one line that seemed to crystallize a whole era of excess. "We don't wake up for less than $10,000 a day." She was the embodiment of a rare kind of power, a woman setting her own price and watching the world for once pay it without argument. She was not just in fashion, she was a unit of measurement for it. When Linda changed her hair, magazines adjusted their mood boards. When Linda disappeared from a city, designers rewrote their casting lists. For a while, it felt as if nothing truly happened in fashion until it passed through her face. 2 decades later, that same woman sat in a darkened apartment calculating routes through her own neighborhood that involved as few reflective surfaces as possible. She had not retired to a countryside villa to protect her mystique, had not slipped into a quiet domestic life in order to keep the legend intact. She was hiding, not from paparazzi, but from herself. Her wardrobe had shifted from sample-size runway looks to oversized black sweaters and trousers chosen less for style than for their ability to disguise the new, wrong shapes underneath. She avoided the small supermarket near her building. She kept the lights low. A cosmetic procedure marketed in gentle fonts as a non-invasive solution, freeze fat, melt fat, no cuts, no downtime, had made sections of her body swell, harden, and distort precisely in the places cameras had once loved most. The line that had once made the world laugh, $10,000 just to get out of bed, came back to haunt her in a different form. Those old interviews were replayed as proof that she had been greedy, out of touch, spoiled. Rarely did anyone ask what kind of system had taught a teenage girl that her best chance at power was to become a flawless surface for other people's projections. Rarer still did anyone ask what it meant that, after a lifetime of doing exactly what that system demanded, a safe treatment could leave her describing herself in a public statement as brutally disfigured. For years she had been the model of control, the woman who could adjust a pose by a millimeter and change an entire photograph. Now she was confronted with a body that did not respond to control at all. Before she became a shorthand for the word supermodel, Linda Evangelista was just Linda, the middle daughter in a Catholic Italian family in St. Catharines, Ontario. The house was tidy, modest, organized around work and church, not around any glamorous fantasy. Her parents had crossed an ocean to build something steady and respectable. The last thing they intended to raise was a girl who would live out of suitcases. Beauty in that environment was treated with suspicion as much as pride. Older relatives would squeeze her cheeks and mutter "che bella ragazza" under their breath. But there was always a shadow in the compliment, a sense that prettiness was a door that opened onto danger. Pretty girls attracted attention. Attention, in their experience, rarely ended well. Adolescence narrowed and sharpened all of that. At school and on the streets of a small Canadian city, Linda learned how quickly admiration could tilt into hostility. Catcalls from passing cars, comments about her body tossed around by boys who felt entitled to rate her out loud. Warnings from adults that she was asking for trouble just by existing in her own skin. All of it blurred together into one clear message. The world was going to look at her whether she wanted it to or not, and she could either learn to steer that gaze or be dragged behind it. For a girl who hated feeling powerless, the choice was obvious, even if the cost was not yet clear. At home, the television flickered with American shows and commercials that sold a different story. Glamorous women whose lives seemed to consist of parties, careers in big cities, and perfect outfits. In mail-order catalogs that arrived at the house, Linda saw static, smiling women modeling dresses and coats on anonymous white backgrounds. She studied those images and understood long before an agent ever spoke to her that someone somewhere was being paid for looking a certain way. It was not that she believed the fantasy wholesale. It was that she recognized instinctively that if beauty was going to follow her around like a rumor, she might as well see if it could pay a bill. The first time she stepped into a pageant, it was less out of a burning desire to wear a crown than out of a restless sense that the life laid out for her. Sensible job, sensible husband, sensible house might fit someone else better. Miss Teen Niagara did what those contests are built to do. It turned a local girl into a commodity. Photographers hovered, agents circled. One of them offered a card and a promise. Come to New York, come to Paris, and see what happens. For a working-class immigrant family, that offer sounded like both opportunity and insult. The argument at the kitchen table lasted for days. In the end, the same stubborn streak that would later say $10,000 or nothing pushed her to leave. The early years of modeling had none of the gloss that would later be associated with her name. New York meant small apartments shared with other girls, casting calls where she was one of 50 almost identical silhouettes waiting in a corridor that smelled of cigarette smoke and hairspray. Japan meant strange hotel rooms, alien food, and clients who treated models like interchangeable props. She learned quickly that the stories sold in magazines, discovered in a supermarket, whisked to Paris, overnight sensation, left out the more common reality. Being told to lose weight, to change her nose, to fix her teeth, to be less this and more that, all in the same breath. What set her apart in that grind was not some mystical aura, but an almost frightening capacity for technical learning. While other teenagers flailed in front of test cameras, she watched the contact sheets and the monitors. She saw how a slight tilt of her head changed the line of her jaw, how narrowing her eyes by a fraction made an expression look intelligent instead of blank, how moving her hand 2 centimeters could turn a clumsy gesture into a sculptural shape. She began to treat her own body as an instrument, experimenting with it the way a musician tests chords and scales. Photographers noticed. One after another, they realized that this young woman didn't just take direction, she anticipated it. She knew before they said anything where the light was, what the clothes were trying to say, what the client was paying for. On set with Stephen Meisel, that strange, almost telepathic competence became legend. He would describe an emotion, not a pose, not a slogan, but a feeling. And before he finished the sentence, she had shifted into it, down to the angle of her fingers. The Polaroids came back with a kind of inevitability. There she was, inhabiting whatever story the brand wanted to tell. From steel-cold couture queens to girls who looked like they had just rolled out of a dive bar at dawn. Assistants whispered that working with her was like working with a dancer and an actor and a mannequin all at once. Clients who counted time in minutes and money in thousands understood something even simpler. When Linda was booked, they would get what they needed, and probably more. In Paris, the industry began to respond. At first, she was one more girl in one more season. Brown hair, good bone structure, steady work. She walked shows, did catalogs, shot editorials that paid more in exposure than in cash. Then, in 1988, came the haircut. Models are told, almost as a rule of survival, never to change their appearance without permission. Their hair does not belong to them, it belongs to the mood boards. Peter Lindbergh, the German photographer whose eye had already anointed several faces as iconic, suggested that Linda crop hers short, not a trim, but a transformation. The rational response would have been to refuse. She agreed. The salon floor filled with long strands, the mirror filled with a stranger. The new cut exposed the architecture of her face in a way no one had quite seen before. It could have been a professional suicide note. Instead, it detonated. The cut made her look both younger and harder, softer and more severe. Designers who had dismissed her as too commercial called her agents back. Editors who had hesitated now built stories around her. Most models fear reinvention because it threatens their bookings. Linda discovered that she could reinvent and be more herself than before. Hair color became another lever she could pull. Brunette one season, flame red the next, ice blonde after that. Each shift was a signal that the weather had changed. Brands tracked her movements. When she signed an exclusive, the announcement read less like a contract and more like a merger. Alongside Christy Turlington and Naomi Campbell, she formed part of an axis the press started calling the Trinity, the three women whose presence could elevate a campaign from a job to an event. Yet even within that trio, Linda occupied a unique position. The technician, the chameleon. The one who could slide into any concept and make it look like it had been written for her. On certain nights in Milan or Paris, the concentration of power in one human being became almost absurd. Backstage at a Versace show, as assistants zipped and pinned and sprayed, a small circle would form around her as she stepped into a dress. Hair and makeup teams adjusted the last details while publicists paced outside, counting minutes until the music started. Linda would glance at herself in the mirror, not admiring but checking alignment, angles, lines. Then when the cue came, she would walk out and turn months of work by dozens of people into a sequence of steps that lasted less than a minute. For the audience, it looked effortless. For the industry, it was proof that she was the safest bet they had. The $10,000 sentence was born in that atmosphere. In a 1990 interview asked about the new economics of modeling, she said with a shrug what every agent already knew and every client privately complained about. "We don't wake up for less than $10,000 a day." On paper, it was a number, a market fact. In the culture, it became a Rorschach test. Some people heard a woman properly valuing her labor in a field that had long underpaid and exploited young girls. Many more heard arrogance. The line was repeated, misquoted, turned into a joke, a warning, a stick with which to beat her for the crime of not being grateful enough. At the time, Linda played along. She leaned into the persona because she understood that persona was part of the job. But beneath the headlines and the campaigns, the reality of her working life was less decadent than the day rate suggested. Sleep deprivation, physical strain from long days in heels and contorted poses, constant travel, scrutiny of every pore, these were the things the number was meant to compensate. The money did not buy immunity from the rigors of the trade. It bought the right to say no occasionally, to insist on certain photographers or teams to walk away from jobs that felt degrading. It was agency, in a world that gave women very little of that word. Time, however, is the one client no contract can negotiate with. As the 1990s shaded into the 2000s, the industry began to chase a different fantasy. Grunge had already briefly dethroned glossy glamour. Now celebrity culture, actors, singers, reality television personalities, started to replace models on magazine covers. The supermodel era receded, its excesses repackaged as nostalgia. The girls who once strode down runways like they owned them found themselves competing for visibility with sitcom stars and pop idols. Linda worked less frequently, by choice as well as circumstance. She had money in the bank, a reputation that allowed her to pick projects selectively, and a new role, motherhood. The birth of her son shifted her center of gravity away from runways and campaign boards towards school calendars and court dates. That transition was not painless. For a woman who had spent decades existing in a loop of fittings, shoots, and shows, the sudden quiet between jobs amplified questions she had long managed to outrun. Who was she when there were no cameras pointed at her? How much of her personality had been shaped not in private trial and error but under studio lights, calibrated to please clients? The culture loved the idea of the supermodel who retired gracefully to family life. It loved less the reality of a middle-aged woman trying to reassemble a self that had always been, in some sense, a public project. Her private life, which she had always guarded carefully, spilled into public view when she entered a highly publicized legal dispute over child support with François-Henri Pinault, billionaire CEO and future husband of actress Salma Hayek. Court filings laid out incomes, expenses, nanny costs, square footage of homes, all of it dissected in tabloids that were delighted to frame the story as a greedy ex versus a noble father. Little attention was paid to the fact that she had carried, birthed, and was raising a child largely outside the public eye, in a society that still assumed that beautiful women lived frictionless lives. The narrative hardened. Once she had been too expensive, now perhaps she was too demanding. Through all of that, another narrative was running quietly underneath. The face that had once paid for everything was no longer guaranteed to do so. High-definition cameras were merciless. Social media created an environment where every candid, every misstep could be frozen and amplified by strangers. The industry around her adapted with a new offering: technology. Non-surgical procedures, injectables, lasers, and machines promised to refresh and maintain what nature and time were working on. The language was carefully chosen: non-invasive, lunchtime procedure, walk in, walk out. The message, repeated so often it became background noise, was simple. There was no need to age naturally anymore, and refusing to do something was almost irresponsible. For a woman whose livelihood had always depended on the fine-tuning of her appearance, the appeal was obvious. Cool sculpting, a cryolipolysis treatment designed to freeze fat in specific areas so the body could gradually eliminate it, fit perfectly into that logic. It wasn't surgery. It didn't involve scalpels or general anesthesia. It was marketed as a smart, controlled way to deal with the little changes that diet and exercise couldn't fix. Linda did not sign up because she was vain or delusional. She signed up because the system she had lived in since adolescence had taught her that vigilance over her body was both expected and rewarded, and because the medicalized beauty industry had positioned itself as a trustworthy extension of self-care. In clinic rooms that smelled of disinfectant and reassurance, applicators were strapped to her skin. The sensation was intense cold, then numbness, then a dull ache. She lay there with a blanket over her, scrolling through her phone, thinking of it as a maintenance appointment rather than an operation. Nurses passed by, machines hummed, consultations moved on in neighboring rooms. On the consent form, somewhere in the dense paragraphs of fine print, was a term almost no layperson had heard before: paradoxical adipose hyperplasia, a very rare side effect. Fat that grows instead of shrinking. The sort of phrase that sounds like a caution inserted more to satisfy regulators than to warn real people. Weeks later, the mirror began to show her something she did not recognize. Not the soft rounding of weight gain. She knew that pattern, had managed it all her life. But firm, protruding bulges that seemed to rise exactly where the applicators had gripped. Her chin, once clean and sharp, developed a pad that no amount of dieting seemed to touch. Her bra line changed shape. Her thighs and flanks carried knots under the skin that felt alien. She tightened her regime. She hired trainers. Nothing budged. Instead, the areas hardened, expanding slowly, implacably. Clothes no longer sat the way they were supposed to. Sample sizes were out of the question. Even the tailored pieces that had once been her armor now betrayed seams and strains in the wrong places. Doctors confirmed the worst. She had developed pH. The treatment meant to destroy fat cells had, in her case, stimulated a growth response. The non-invasive fix had triggered a condition that could not be undone without real surgery. Liposuction, excision, scars. Even then, success was not guaranteed. She underwent corrective operations anyway because the alternative was to live indefinitely in a body that felt hijacked. The procedures left her bruised, sore, stitched. Some of the growths reduced, but the contours of her body remained altered. Numbness and nerve pain set in. The woman who had once understood her physical instrument down to the smallest detail now found herself in a permanent state of estrangement from it. Psychologically, the damage was corrosive. Fashion had always been cruel to women who aged, but it had never before had such obvious physical evidence to work with. Linda began to decline jobs without explanation. She stopped attending shows, not because she had suddenly grown indifferent to the world she had helped build, but because the idea of sitting in a front row, watched and photographed from angles she could no longer control, felt unbearable. Friends noticed a shrinking of her world. Fewer dinners, fewer appearances, more cancellations. Inside her home, mirrors were covered or avoided. Getting dressed became less about pleasure or expression and more about defense, how to leave the house while revealing as little as possible. The isolation fed on itself. The less she went out, the more terrifying the idea of being seen became. In the absence of information, rumors filled the gap. Some assumed she had chosen a quiet life. Others whispered that she had let herself go. Neither scenario matched the reality of a woman living with pain and disfigurement caused by a technology that the culture at large was still cheerfully advertising to millions of other women as an easy fix. What made it worse was the sense of shame. On some level, Linda blamed herself. She had not been coerced into the clinic. She had signed the forms. She had believed the promises because they were designed to align perfectly with everything she had been taught to value. Depression, when it arrived, did not look like dramatic outbursts or public breakdowns. It looked like unanswered messages, appointments postponed and then quietly canceled, days that melted into each other behind drawn curtains. For someone whose entire adult life had been scheduled in 15-minute increments, the absence of structure quickly stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like freefall. Therapy helped, slowly, but even in the safety of a professional's office, she sometimes struggled to articulate the absurdity of her situation. One of the most photographed women of the late 20th century now frightened of the camera lens on her own phone. In 2021, after years of silence, she decided to put the truth in writing. On Instagram, the very platform where younger models curated feeds of impossibly smooth, filtered faces, she posted not a glamorous image, but a block of text. "To my followers who have wondered why I have not been working," it began, "while my peers' careers have been thriving, the reason is that I was brutally disfigured by Zeltique's cool sculpting procedure." She named the condition paradoxical adipose hyperplasia and described its impact: deformity, swelling, pain, the destruction of her livelihood, the descent into depression and self-loathing. It was a disclosure that cut directly against the grain of the medium. Instead of selling a fantasy, she submitted evidence. The response was immediate and messy. Many women, famous and anonymous, saw themselves in her story. They had not all undergone cool sculpting, but they recognized the machinery. The marketing of insecurity, the bundling of risk into phrases like very rare. The sense that if something went wrong, it would be treated as their private shame rather than a public scandal. Other voices were less kind. Comment sections filled with armchair moralists asking why she needed any procedure at all, why she could not simply embrace aging. The question might have had weight in a vacuum. Coming from a culture that had spent decades rewarding her for looking impossibly young, then punishing her with invisibility when she dared to step away, it rang hollow. Her lawsuit against the company behind the machine translated the emotional catastrophe into legal terms: negligence, failure to warn, financial loss. The corporation responded with the language corporations always use: robust safety profiles, regulatory approval, the tiny percentages of adverse events. Somewhere between the affidavits and the press releases was the uncomfortable truth that even a 1% risk is catastrophic when you are the one it lands on, and that the system in which such machines thrive is predicated on the idea that a certain amount of collateral damage is acceptable in the pursuit of profit. The case was ultimately settled out of court. The settlement did not come with a public apology. The devices remained available. The phrase "rare side effect" continued to do a great deal of heavy lifting in brochures. Linda, meanwhile, began a different kind of return. In 2022, she appeared on the cover of British Vogue, styled by Edward Enninful and shot once again by Stephen Meisel. The images were recognizably her and yet not. Hats, scarves, and high collars framed her face, drawing attention to the eyes that had always been her strongest weapon. Inside the accompanying interview, she refused to pretend. She described the tape and elastics used to smooth and pull, the padding under clothes, the careful angles. "I'm trying to love myself as I am," she said, but she did not pretend that she had reached serenity. At one point, she voiced a sentence that would have sounded banal coming from anyone else: "I don't care how I age, I just want to age." Coming out of her mouth after everything, it landed like an indictment. This was a woman who had spent her 20s and 30s being told that aging was the enemy, whose entire career had been built on being the embodiment of an eternal now. For her to say she just wanted to age was not a rejection of vanity. It was a plea for the right to move through time without having her body turned into a battleground for technologies, trends, and corporate revenue targets. The procedure that had damaged her had literally involved freezing parts of her flesh, an attempt to halt change that had ended in a more grotesque distortion than aging could ever have produced on its own. The shoot's power lay not in any illusion of a miraculous restoration, but in the acknowledgement of artifice. Fashion had always been a choreography of concealment and emphasis. What changed here was that the concealment itself became part of the story. For once, the tricks were not used only to hide age or weight from the audience. They were revealed as evidence of how much effort goes into achieving the images women are told they should resemble. It was a rare moment when the apparatus of beauty allowed itself to be seen as apparatus. The Apple TV Plus docuseries The Supermodels extended that reckoning. In archival footage, a young Linda stalks the runway, laughs backstage with Naomi and Christy, does goofy dances in airport corridors. She is impossibly alive, the camera's favorite accomplice. In new interviews, wrapped in a turban, face fuller, voice steady, she speaks about contracts, lawsuits, PAH. The contrast is not simply between before and after, pretty and damaged. It is between a world that believed beauty could be controlled and a woman who has learned, the hardest way possible, that control has limits. The docuseries is ostensibly a celebration of a glamorous era. Linda's segments quietly turn it into an indictment as well. None of this transforms her into a saint. Linda Evangelista is not a simple victim of forces beyond her comprehension. She was, for years, a general in the very army that policed the boundaries of what was considered beautiful. She upheld standards that hurt other women. Her campaigns helped sell products and fantasies that contributed to the insecurity that now feeds the cosmetic procedure economy. Recognizing that does not cancel out her suffering. It complicates it, which is the only honest way to approach her story. The system did not suddenly turn on an innocent outsider. It eventually consumed one of its most loyal servants. For women watching from a distance, her story functions like a mirror with the brightness turned down. Most will never earn $10,000 a day or see their face on a billboard. But many know what it is to feel that their worth lives in how well they obey beauty's rules, and to fear the consequences of breaking them. Linda's public unraveling of the non-invasive myth punctures the fantasy that there is a safe path through this maze if one is only careful, informed, disciplined enough. She was all of those things, and it still went wrong. In living rooms and bathrooms around the world, her Instagram post and the interviews that followed have been read on phones held in hands that have traced their own perceived imperfections in mirrors. Women who had saved for procedures, who had believed marketing lines about freezing fat or smoothing skin, suddenly found themselves asking questions they had been encouraged not to ask. What happens if I am the rare case? Who carries the risk when something goes wrong? Me or the company that profits? How much of my anxiety was created so that someone else could sell me a solution? Younger models raised on filters and Facetune rather than film contact sheets have reached out to her as well. For them, Linda is both a legend and a cautionary tale. Proof that no amount of success inoculates a woman against a culture that sees her body as raw material. In private conversations and public comments, they describe agencies suggesting procedures, managers hinting that a small tweak might keep them competitive a few years longer. Her willingness to name what happened draws a line they can point to when they say no. Whether that line will hold against the pressure of an industry built on replacement is an open question. That is precisely why her case is so unnerving. If even Linda, disciplined, informed, wealthy, connected, could be chewed up by a safe beauty technology and spat out into depression and seclusion, what hope do ordinary women have of navigating the same landscape safely? If a face that once commanded $10,000 a day can be treated as disposable collateral damage once it no longer fits the template, what does that say about the value assigned to bodies that were never valued so highly to begin with? Linda Evangelista will always be the woman whose cheekbones helped define an age, the model who could turn a haircut into a market event, the supermodel who said the quiet part out loud about money. But her most important legacy may be as a kind of living cross-examination of the era that made her. Every advertisement that promises transformation without risk now carries, whether it admits it or not, the ghost of her experience. Every influencer recommending a quick tweak to fix some perceived flaw is, whether they know it or not, participating in an economy that once told the most photographed woman in the world that freezing her fat was a simple, clever choice. So when we look back at the iconic pictures, the Versace runways, the George Michael video, the Meisel covers, and then see the woman who now sometimes chooses a headscarf and a dark pair of glasses for a quick walk to the shop, the question is not simply, what happened to her? The more honest question is, what did we build that made this outcome possible, even predictable? Was Linda Evangelista destroyed by vanity or by an industry and a culture that taught her and millions like her that their safety lay in obedience to ever more invasive definitions of improvement? If beauty was once Linda Evangelista's greatest source of power and protection, what does it mean that beauty, weaponized through technology and profit, eventually turned on her body like an enemy? And in a world that still sells women on the idea that compliance with its beauty rules will keep them safe, are we really living in a civilization that celebrates beauty? Or inside a system that punishes women again and again for daring to trust it?